Power's already all the way up and the battery's low, so it takes there's a long recycle time there. Hi guys, I'm your friend. Hopefully, if not, hopefully I will be. My name is Kevin Douglas. I am a photographer by trade and by choice, by birth, I guess. It feels like it's my calling, so I would do it even if I didn't make any money. But right now, business is slow. You know, people are social distancing and everything responsibly, and there's not as many shoots to do. Money's not so much an issue, but having a creative outlet is. I need that creative outlet where I get depressed and stuff, and you know, I'm bipolar, and so here we are. Thought I would start a little photography class, and we're doing it in the middle of the night because of said bipolar disorder. I am manic right now, but you know, it'll be up at all hours, and I'm gonna post it on YouTube too. We're just filming with the cell phone as a Facebook Live video. Just, you know, pilot episode, so you know how that is. Stick with us, it'll develop. First of all, before we even get into it, the number one thing people see when they see me with this camera or whatever and a big old lens on it is, wow, that's an awesome camera or lens or both combo, comma, I bet it takes awesome pictures. Let's talk about that. Equipment, it's probably the least important thing in a photographer's arsenal. It's a tool. They are tools, and they help make the job easier. The nicer your tools are, the easier the job is to do. You can get it done with hammers and chisels, but you introduce power tools. See what I'm saying? It's a whole different game. But a good photographer should be able to take a good photo with any quality of camera. I have a Canon 5D Mark III right now. I'm waiting for the 5DR, the R5, Canon R5. It's a replacement for the D line. It's a new mirrorless thing. I've been waiting to upgrade. It's been around, the Mark III has been around since 2012, I believe. I've had my copy since either late 2015 or early 2016. It is getting to the point where it's falling behind, definitely, in technology, and it's harder to keep up with. I have to put more and more work into it to get the same level of work as other people, but I can still get it. That's the point. As a good photographer, you shouldn't be worried about, right now, at this level, assuming you're a beginner, this is where we're starting, at a beginner level. All you need is a camera that you can control manually, the function, the settings. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You might see on your mode dial, I know this is going to be mirrored, it's on M, if I can get it focused there. M for manual. If you turn that, we have AV on a Canon, which is aperture priority. TV, or I think it's S on Nikon, that's shutter priority. And then P is like an auto mode. Just stay away from that P. If I were starting out, if I were you, I would start an aperture priority, probably. That's where I started. And that's what I would recommend for a beginner. We can talk about why and stuff, get up to all that. But as long as you can adjust those three settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, then we're in the game, baby. You're ready. So let's talk. Now that you've got your camera, the aperture, shutter speed, and the ISO. You've been hearing those three things. Bam, 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 bam. You're gonna hear them a lot. Those three elements make up the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is what builds a photograph. A properly exposed photograph like this is, this is properly exposed, at least from what I can see. The highlights aren't too blown out, the shadows aren't too dark. You can see me, I'm well lit. That's a good exposure. The light, we're talking about the amount of light. Photography literally means painting with light, I believe. So it's all about the light. The game is how the light gets into the camera, to the sensor. You can think of the sensor as film, if that helps. There are cameras with different size sensors. Most professionals will have a full frame camera like mine, has a larger sensor, but most people will have a crop sensor, APS-C sized sensor. It's slightly smaller. No big deal. You'll learn about that later. If I need to make any conversions or anything, I will tell you that it would be different on an APS-C sensor. But for right now, we're just talking about how the light gets to the sensor. So it enters the lens, and you have the aperture is the opening of the lens. You can close it down, real small opening, or open it up as wide as it'll go. Now, imagine this is a bucket of water. Smaller hole, it's going to let the water in or out slower. Bigger hole is going to let it in or out faster. So if you open up that aperture, you get more light in. The shutter speed is another way to control your light or your exposure. The longer your shutter is open, you got your aperture set, say you're shooting at, we won't even say numbers anymore, right yet. So this is just beginner. Say we've got it set here, and just to make numbers easy, say we set our shutter speed for X number of seconds. It'll be a fraction of a second, like 1/200th, 1/500th, but we could just say like a second to make the math easy. If it's open for 1 second, how much light got through there in that 1 second versus this one's going to be a lot darker than this one, right? So that's one way to affect it. Or versus faster shutter speed. Slower shutter speed, at times let in more light. It's going to be brighter. slower shutter speed, like 1 second or even 1/10, 1/25 of a second, let in a lot more light than say 1/200th of a second or 1/2000th, 1/8000th of a second. It's going to be darker. We're talking about total light and exposure. There's more to it than that, and we will get into it, but these are, we're just talking about the light and building exposure right now. ISO, our third element in the exposure triangle, is your sensor's sensitivity to light. If you increase the ISO, it'll get brighter because your sensor gets more sensitive and picks up more light. But it gets grainier, what we call noise. You lose detail in the shadows and the highlights, and the color gets, noisy and gets grainy. And so you want to try and keep your ISO as low as you can. Typically, in any given situation, you want it high enough to have the shutter speed that you need, but ideally as low as you can. Base ISO is usually 100. Can go up to, it goes sky high, but I mean, I don't take mine over 6400. That's fairly grainy, but that, nighttime shots, or if it's a nightclub or a party or something where it's not very well lit, concert, things like that, you need a higher ISO. And you will notice that those darker images, or even on movies, if they're not all CGI, will be grainier, noisier. So that's the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, how sensitive it is. So we're letting the light in to the lens. It hits that sensor. We decide how sensitive it is to the light. We decide how open this aperture is, and we decide how long that it's open for. That's how we build our exposure. So you can adjust more than one thing and have the same level of brightness, the same a properly exposed photograph. You can open the aperture up wider and then have a faster shutter speed. An aperture that is I'm gonna throw some terminology out there, but we measure in photography, most of our measurements are called stops. So that's a term I'll be using, you should be familiar with if you're gonna follow along. And one stop of light, if you increase the exposure by one stop, you are doubling the amount of light. If you would decrease the exposure by one stop, you're cutting the amount of light in half. If you hear my dog snoring underneath the tripod. If you have the aperture set at, we measure it in f stops. So we'll say f 4.0. And then you open it. The smaller the number, the wider open it is. So say f4. And then we open it up to, the next stop is f2.8. We'll go over the f stops later, but that's twice as wide as f4. So if you want the same amount of brightness, you have to cut your shutter speed in half. It'll give you the same amount of brightness, but it won't give you the same look. The wider open your aperture is, the shallower your depth of field is going to be. A wide open aperture is going to give you a real blurry background. Lets the light in real fast, so you have a quick shutter speed when the aperture is wide open. And portraits, I like to do them this way, and usually, isolate your subject. It's called subject isolation. You can blur out that background, just makes them pop out. A longer shutter speed with a smaller aperture is going to give you more depth of field. Depth of field is how much is in focus. So you'll see like a landscape, and a lot of it's in focus. You know, I didn't plan any of this, so I'm just riffing, trying to think of what I should cover and what I have covered and might have missed. I know it's a long shot to think that anybody might actually watch this and follow along, but you know, if you do happen to, and you have any questions or anything, I would love to answer them. Or if you have any contradicting opinions, I don't think I've stated anything that's really opinion yet, but any information that you think that may contradict my information, I'd be happy to discuss that. So, exposure triangle, that's basics. You set your aperture, you set your shutter speed, you set your ISO. And I will give you a little demonstration here. It's probably a good idea, right? We have a ultra wide angle lens on right now, or 14 to 24 f2.8. You don't know what that means yet, probably, but it's a wide angle lens. It's going to capture a lot of stuff. Squat down here for it. So put it in live view for you so you can see the screen. My settings. We're going to open up the aperture to f2.8 because that's as wide as it goes. We're going to slow down the shutter speed because it's dark in here. We're going to crank up the ISO because it's dark in here. We need that sensor to be sensitive to the light that we have. So I'm going to take it up to 6400. You can see as I turn the ISO down, it gets darker. As I increase the ISO, it's at 5,000, that's 10,000, and take it all the way up, but it's going to get noisier and grainier. 6,400 is about as high as I like to take it. Oops. Sorry. Focus there. There we go. So it's still a little underexposed. Our shutter speed is at 1/30th of a second, which is slow for a shutter speed, but on this wide of a focal length, we'll talk about that later, it's an okay shutter speed, especially if you have a tripod or something, but it's okay. We don't want to go much slower though. Basically, if you don't have image stabilization, you don't want to, like if you're at 50 millimeters, you don't want to shoot faster than 1/50th of a second. So we're at 24, we don't want to shoot faster than 1/24th of a second. We're at 1/30th, we're fine. So we're still a little underexposed, but it's okay. Still, it's pretty well exposed actually, considering it's a lot brighter here than it is in real life. But the highlights are probably going to be blown out on that stupid screen that you see. But so we adjust our aperture. It's at 2.8. Take it down a stop to f4, and we got half the light. Take it to 5.6 is the next stop, and we got half the light again. Make it smaller, down, close it down to f8. We got half the light, and then we got f11, f16, f22, and it would continue from there. That's if you want a lot of stuff in focus, and actually at that point you'll get a little something called fringing, and you might not want that, but you'll figure that out. We want to open it up as wide as we can to take advantage of the light that we have. Now, probably we have two options then, because this is as wide as our aperture gets on this lens, is 2.8. We have some that open wider, not this one. Zoom lenses usually don't open quite as wide as fixed focal length lenses. So we can slow down our shutter speed from 1/30th to 1/15th of a second would be a stop, and that would give us twice the light. Or well, we don't have to jump down a whole stop even. There's 1/30th, 1/25th, 1/20th, 1/15th is looks good to me, and it's reading right on our meter. So 1/15th of a second at 6400. That's a little slow. We can. I would never hold the camera like this in a shoot, but I'll do it so that you can see. We can take a picture, and it's blurry. I know you can't really see there, but the shutter speed is too slow. So let's take it back up to 1/30th. We were at 1/15th. Let's double it, and we'll take the ISO up a stop. Even though I don't like to go above 6400, we'll take it up to 12,800. Now we are at f2.8, 1/30th of a second, and ISO 2800. Same exposure, much sharper. So, I mean, them's the basics. We can talk about more and, you know, talk about individual details in different lenses and different classes. We can talk about gear. We can talk about the difference between zoom lenses and prime lenses. We can talk about focal lengths, and we can talk about distortion, and we can talk about chromatic aberration. We can talk about color fringing. We can talk about editing. We can talk about lighting. But probably next will be composition. That's probably where we'll start as far as our real lessons go. It's kind of an introductory thing, I guess. I'm just going to introduce you to the exposure triangle and introduce myself and set up this situation. But composition, I think, is where we'll probably start. That's something that is, whether you are aware of it or not, you probably take into account even when you take your picture, your just snapshots with your phone. It's just where things are at in the photo, you know. Composition right now, I'm in the middle. We have my strip light over here in the background, but there's something called the rule of thirds where I could get on like the 1/3 mark here, and that would feel compositionally okay. It feels that thing's throwing a little bit off balance, but if I was like, you know, that's the rule of thirds. Center, of course, a little boring, but classic. 1/3 again. Those are compositional rules. Also, my eye level is at the 2/3 mark approximately, and I'm at the 2/3 mark, or the 1/3 mark here. So if I drop down, if I was more like just right there, taking composition into no account whatsoever, looks goofy and unprofessional, right? This is much better. Something like this, or this even. Just a straight on approach. So, you know what composition is innately. I will help teach you some rules about it and just break it down for you and help you understand it on a deeper level and help you to know how to apply it in your own photographs and even just snapshots. Composition is something that you don't need to even have a manual camera. So that's gonna benefit you no matter what you're shooting with. Cell phone, 5D, or a disposable Kodak from a vending machine. If you can time travel back to 1994. But I think that's a pretty decent intro to this class. I think going over, you know, again, but I think I covered enough don't think I covered too much, hopefully, because I was more worried about covering too much than not enough, and I was rambling. I tend to do that, and I'm manic, like I said. So. But I have enjoyed this, and I will be back to do this more. So, thank you guys. I appreciate you. Get creative. Get out there. Do something creative. Hopefully photography, maybe. It's an option. And I will help you with it if you want. So you guys, continue to keep growing. Keep loving. And peace easy. Bye-bye.